My name is Clara, and I was happily married to Daniel. Let me rephrase that. I thought I was happily married to Daniel. We were together for 6 years, married for 3. He is a good man. Kind, intelligent, hardworking, or at least, that's the man I thought I knew. The problem, as it almost always is, was his mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a force of nature, a meticulously manicured, diamond-encrusted, passive-aggressive force of nature. From the moment Daniel introduced me, I felt like I was being sized up, weighed, and ultimately found wanting. I remember that first dinner like it was yesterday. Daniel was beaming, clearly proud to introduce me to his parents. We went to some ridiculously fancy restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the waiter judges you silently if you even think about asking for ketchup. Eleanor was already there, sitting ramrod straight in a velvet booth, her expression fixed in what I later came to recognize as her "I'm tolerating your existence" face. Her husband Arthur was there too, a quiet, almost apologetic man who seemed to fade into the background whenever Eleanor was around. "Clara, darling, so nice to finally meet you," Eleanor said, her tone suggesting that meeting me was about as appealing as a root canal. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned me from head to toe. I was wearing a simple black dress, which I thought was elegant enough for the occasion, but under Eleanor's gaze, I suddenly felt like I was dressed for a picnic. The conversation that followed was excruciating. Eleanor peppered me with questions about my family, my job, my education, each question delivered with a subtle hint of condescension. She seemed particularly interested in my family's financial situation, her tone turning almost predatory when she learned that we were, well, decidedly not wealthy. "So, you're a librarian?" she asked, her lip curling slightly. "How charming." I tried to laugh it off, but the barb stung. "I love my job," I said, trying to project confidence. "I get to share my passion for reading with others." "Indeed," Eleanor replied, her eyes glazing over. "Daniel always had such lofty ambitions. I suppose everyone has to find their own path." The dinner went downhill from there. Every attempt I made to connect with Eleanor was met with a polite but firm wall of resistance. I tried to talk about my hobbies, my interests, anything to find some common ground, but she always managed to steer the conversation back to Daniel, praising his accomplishments, his intelligence, his potential. It was clear that, in her eyes, I was a distraction, a stumbling block on his road to success. Daniel, bless his heart, seemed oblivious to the tension. He kept smiling at me, squeezing my hand under the table, trying to include me in the conversation. But even his presence couldn't completely shield me from Eleanor's disapproval. That night, after Daniel dropped me off at my apartment, I felt drained and deflated. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that Eleanor was just a bit eccentric. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. I had a feeling that this dinner was just the opening salvo in a much larger war. And I was right. So right. The next few months were a constant barrage of subtle and not-so-subtle attacks. Eleanor would call Daniel constantly, ostensibly to check in on him, but always managing to slip in a dig at me. She'd criticize my cooking even though she'd never actually eaten my cooking, my decorating style, even the way I dressed. "Daniel, darling, that shirt looks a bit faded," she'd say. "Clara, dear, perhaps you could invest in a little color for him. Black is so draining." Or, "Daniel, are you eating properly? You look a little thin." "Clara, dear, are you making sure he's getting enough protein?" It was relentless. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as just Eleanor being Eleanor, but it was wearing me down. I started to feel like I was constantly being judged, constantly being found wanting. And then the real trouble started. The scheming started. The slow, insidious campaign to dismantle my marriage. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Little comments, little suggestions, designed to plant seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind. Daniel, darling, are you sure Clara is happy? I mean, she seems like such a homebody. Don't you think she might be stifling your ambition? Or, Daniel, you deserve someone who truly understands your potential. Someone who can support you, encourage you to reach for the stars. At first, Daniel dismissed these comments as just Eleanor being dramatic. But the comments kept coming, chipping away at his defenses, slowly but surely eroding his confidence in our relationship. The turning point, I think, was when Eleanor started subtly introducing Daniel to other women. Just friends, she'd say innocently. People the first think you'd really connect with. These friends were all accomplished, attractive, and, most importantly, single. They were everything in Eleanor's eyes that I wasn't. They were the kind of women she thought Daniel deserved. One of these women was named Giselle. She was an executive at a major investment firm, elegant, sophisticated, and oozing ambition. Eleanor made sure that Daniel and Giselle bumped into each other at several social events. She'd orchestrate conversations, leaving Daniel and Giselle alone to network. I saw it happening. I saw the way Giselle looked at Daniel, the way she hung on his every word. And I saw the way Daniel, initially hesitant, started to respond. He was flattered, of course. Who wouldn't be? Giselle was everything that Eleanor wanted him to be with. Successful and driven. I confronted Daniel about it. "What's going on with you and Giselle?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "She's just a friend." "Eleanor introduced us." "I know that," I said, my voice rising. "But I see the way she looks at you. And I see the way you're starting to look at her." He sighed. "Clara, you're being paranoid. There's nothing going on. You're the one I love." I wanted to believe him. I desperately needed to believe him. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Eleanor was watering it every day. "This is getting long, I know. But I need to tell you all of it, every single detail, so you can understand just how insidious Eleanor's plan was. I need to tell you how she slowly but surely dismantled my marriage, piece by piece. I'm going to stop here for now. I need a break. But I'll be back. I have so much more to tell you, so much more pain to unpack." So where was I? Right, the Giselle situation. After that conversation with Daniel, the one where he swore nothing was going on, things actually got worse. He started spending more and more time working late, or networking with colleagues. He was less attentive, less affectionate. He seemed distant. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd just brush me off. "You're imagining things, Clara," he'd say. "I'm just busy. Work is really demanding right now." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My gut was screaming at me, telling me that Eleanor's plan was working, that she was driving a wedge between us. One evening, Daniel told me he had to go to a mandatory work dinner. He was vague about the details, just said it was important for his career. I tried to act casual, but inside, I was a mess. "Who's going to be there?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just colleagues," he said, avoiding my gaze. "You know, the usual suspects." I knew, of course, that Giselle would be there. I could practically feel Eleanor's manipulative hand orchestrating the whole thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind racing. I kept replaying the conversation with Daniel, searching for some sign, some clue that would confirm my suspicions. But all I found was doubt and uncertainty. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave up on sleep. I got out of bed, went to the living room, and turned on the TV. I flipped through the channels, but nothing could hold my attention. My mind was too preoccupied with Daniel, with Giselle, with Eleanor, and her twisted game. Suddenly, I had an idea. A terrible, impulsive, probably a really bad idea kind of idea. I decided to go to the restaurant where Daniel was supposed to be having his mandatory work dinner. I know. It sounds like something out of a bad rom-com, but I was desperate. I needed to know, one way or another, what was going on. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed out the door. The restaurant was about a 20-minute drive away. As I drove, my anxiety grew with each passing mile. What if I was wrong? What if Daniel really was just having a harmless work dinner? I'd look like a crazy, jealous wife. But what if I was right? What if Eleanor had succeeded in setting Daniel up with Giselle? By the time I reached the restaurant, my hands were shaking. I parked across the street and sat in my car, trying to calm myself down. I watched the entrance, waiting for Daniel to appear. After about half an hour, I saw him. He was walking out of the restaurant, laughing and talking to someone. And that someone was Giselle. They were standing close together, their bodies almost touching. Giselle was smiling, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. He was looking at her with an expression I hadn't seen in months, an expression of genuine interest and admiration. My heart sank. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It was even worse than I had imagined. I watched them for a few more minutes, paralyzed with shock and disbelief. They walked to Giselle's car, still talking and laughing. He opened the door for her, then leaned down to say something. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the way they were looking at each other. It was obvious. They were attracted to each other. I couldn't take it anymore. I started my car and drove away, tears streaming down my face. I drove aimlessly, not knowing where I was going. I just needed to escape, to get away from the pain. I ended up at a park on the outskirts of town. I parked the car and sat on a bench, sobbing uncontrollably. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and utterly heartbroken. How could Daniel do this to me? How could he let Eleanor manipulate him like this? I stayed at the park for hours, just crying and trying to make sense of what had happened. As the sun began to rise, I started to feel a sense of anger, a burning, righteous anger. I was done. I was done being Eleanor's punching bag. I was done being a pawn in her twisted game. I was done being the victim. I decided then and there that I was going to fight back. I wasn't going to let Eleanor destroy my life. I was going to expose her, to show Daniel the truth about his mother's manipulation. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Eleanor was a powerful woman, with a lot of resources at her disposal, but I was determined. I had nothing left to lose. The next day, I started gathering evidence. I went through Daniel's phone records, his emails, anything that could prove that Eleanor had been actively trying to sabotage our marriage. It was a painstaking process, but I was relentless. I found emails between Eleanor and Giselle, coordinating their accidental encounters. I found text messages from Eleanor to Daniel, filled with subtle digs at me and praise for Giselle. I even found a draft of a letter that Eleanor had written to Daniel, urging him to leave me and pursue a relationship with Giselle. The evidence was damning. It was clear that Eleanor had been plotting this for months, carefully manipulating Daniel and Giselle to get them together. Armed with this evidence, I confronted Daniel. I laid everything out in front of him. The emails, the text messages, the letter. I watched his face as he read through it all, his expression shifting from disbelief to shock to horror. I can't believe it, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. My mother, she would never. She did, Daniel, I said, my voice trembling with anger. She's been trying to destroy our marriage from the beginning. And you let her do it. He looked at me, his eyes filled with remorse. I didn't realize, he said. I thought she just wanted what was best for me. What's best for you? I scoffed. Or what's best for her? She wants you to be with someone who fits her idea of success, someone who can make her look good. She doesn't care about your happiness, Daniel. She only cares about herself. He was silent for a long time, staring at the evidence in front of him. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Clara, he said. I've been such an idiot. I let her manipulate me. I let her drive us apart. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to forgive him. But the damage had been done. The trust was broken. It's too late, Daniel, I said, my voice flat. I can't do this anymore. I can't live with the constant suspicion, the constant manipulation. I'm done. And with that, I walked out. I walked out of our apartment, out of our marriage, and out of Daniel's life. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I loved Daniel, or at least, I thought I loved him. But I couldn't stay with someone who was so easily manipulated, someone who was so blind to his own mother's toxic influence. I needed to be free. I needed to escape from Eleanor's clutches. I needed to rebuild my life on my own terms. So, that's what I did. I moved out of the apartment, found a new job, and started therapy. It was a long and painful process, but slowly, I started to heal. I haven't spoken to Daniel or Eleanor since that day. I don't know if Daniel ever confronted his mother. I don't know if he and Giselle ever got together. And honestly, I don't care. I'm finally starting to move on. I'm starting to feel like myself again. I'm starting to believe that I can find happiness, even after everything that's happened. But the scars are still there. The memories still haunt me. And the anger, well, the anger is still simmering beneath the surface. I still think about Eleanor sometimes, about the way she tried to destroy my life. And I wonder, will she ever face the consequences of her actions? That's what I'm going to talk about in the next part. What happened after I left Daniel? The fallout. The revenge, maybe? So, yeah, revenge. Let's talk about that. After I walked out on Daniel, the first told myself I was done. Done with the drama, done with the fighting, done with Eleanor. I wanted to focus on healing, on rebuilding my life. But as the weeks turned into months, the anger just wouldn't fade. It festered inside me, a constant reminder of Eleanor's betrayal. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, replaying those awful scenes in my head. Her smug face, her condescending comments, her manipulative schemes. It was all so vivid, so infuriating. My therapist kept telling me to let it go, to focus on forgiveness. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, she'd say. I understood the logic, but I just couldn't do it. Eleanor had gotten away with it. She'd destroyed my marriage, caused me immense pain, and faced absolutely no consequences. And that felt wrong. I started fantasizing about revenge. Nothing violent, of course. I'm not that kind of person. But I wanted her to feel some of the pain she had inflicted on me. I wanted her to understand the damage she had caused. I spent hours brainstorming different ways to get back at her. I considered writing a scathing letter, detailing all of her manipulative behavior. I thought about exposing her to her friends and family, revealing the truth about her toxic personality. But none of those options felt satisfying. They were too direct, too predictable. I wanted something more subtle, more insidious, something that would strike at the heart of her carefully constructed image. Then, one day, I had an idea. It was a risky idea, a potentially disastrous idea, but it was also brilliant. At least, I thought so at the time. I remembered something Daniel had told me about Eleanor's biggest fear: financial ruin. She was obsessed with money, with maintaining her wealthy lifestyle. She lived in constant fear of losing it all. And then it hit me. What if I could somehow expose her financial secrets? What if I could reveal some hidden debt, some shady investment, something that would tarnish her reputation and threaten her financial security? It was a long shot, I knew. Eleanor was meticulous about her finances. She had a team of lawyers and accountants to protect her assets. But I was determined to find something, anything, that I could use against her. I started digging. I used every resource at my disposal, scouring public records, searching online databases, even enlisting the help of a friend who worked in the financial industry. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. I spent weeks poring over documents, chasing dead ends, and feeling increasingly discouraged. But then, one day, I struck gold. My friend called me, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Clara, I think I found something," he said. It's a bit complicated, but it looks like Eleanor has been involved in some questionable investments. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, the whole 9 yards. He sent me the documents he had found, and I spent the next few hours poring over them. It was complicated, as he had said, but I was able to piece together a picture of Eleanor's shady financial dealings. It turned out that she had been using a series of offshore accounts to hide millions of dollars from the IRS. She had also invested in several shell corporations, which appeared to be involved in money laundering. The evidence was damning. If exposed, it could lead to serious legal trouble for Eleanor. She could face hefty fines, even jail time. I was ecstatic. I had finally found a way to get back at her. I had found a way to make her pay for what she had done. But then, a wave of doubt washed over me. Was this really the right thing to do? Was I willing to risk Eleanor's financial ruin, even potential jail time, just to satisfy my own desire for revenge? It was a difficult question. On the one hand, Eleanor deserved it. She had caused me so much pain, and she had shown no remorse for her actions. On the other hand, I wasn't sure if I could live with the consequences of my actions. I wasn't sure if I could be responsible for ruining someone's life, even if they deserved it. I wrestled with this dilemma for days. I talked to my therapist, I talked to my friends, I even talked to myself in the mirror. Finally, I came to a decision. I decided that I wasn't going to expose Eleanor's financial secrets, yet I realized that I didn't want to ruin her life. I just wanted her to know that I knew. I wanted her to understand that her secrets weren't safe, that I had the power to expose her at any time. I wanted to scare her. I wanted to make her squirm. I wanted her to finally understand the pain she had caused me. So I decided to send her a letter. An anonymous letter, of course. I didn't want her to know that it was me. I carefully crafted the letter, detailing all of her financial misdeeds. I included specific dates, account numbers, and names of the shell corporations. I made it clear that I had all the evidence I needed to expose her, but I didn't threaten to do so. Instead, I ended the letter with a simple message: "I know what you did." I mailed the letter to Eleanor's home address, then waited. I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, I received a phone call from Daniel. His voice was frantic. "Clara, you need to talk to me," he said. "Something's going on with my mother. She's terrified." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "She received a letter," he said. "An anonymous letter. It accuses her of some serious financial crimes." My heart started pounding. "And what does she say about it?" I asked. "She's denying everything, of course," he said. "But I can tell she's scared. Really scared. She's hired a team of lawyers, and they're trying to figure out who sent the letter." I paused, trying to decide what to say. "Well, if she's done nothing wrong, she has nothing to worry about," I said finally. "But Clara," he started to say, but I cut him off. "I have to go, Daniel," I said. "I'm busy." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. It had worked. My plan had worked. Eleanor was terrified. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I had finally gotten back at her. I had made her pay for what she had done, but the feeling didn't last long. As I sat there, alone in my apartment, I started to feel guilty. Had I gone too far? Had I crossed a line? Was I becoming just as manipulative and vindictive as Eleanor? The questions swirled in my head, gnawing at my conscience. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and watch Eleanor squirm. I decided to call Daniel back. "Daniel," I said when he answered the phone, I need to tell you something. This is where things get really complicated, because what I told Daniel next changed everything. It set off a chain of events that I never could have predicted, and it led to a confrontation that I'll never forget. I'm going to stop here for now. I need to gather my thoughts. The next part is going to be intense. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I sent the letter." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear Daniel's mind racing, trying to process what I had just told him. You sent the letter? He finally stammered, his voice filled with disbelief. But why? Why would you do that? I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. Because I wanted her to know, I said. I wanted her to know that I knew what she had done. I wanted her to understand the pain she had caused me. But this could ruin her, Clara, he exclaimed. This could send her to jail. Maybe she deserves it, I said, my voice hardening. After everything she's done, maybe she deserves to face the consequences. But she's my mother, Clara, he pleaded. I can't just stand by and watch her life fall apart. And what about me, Daniel? I asked, my voice rising. Did you stand by and watch my life fall apart? Did you stand by and watch your mother manipulate you, turning you against me? He was silent for a moment. I know I made mistakes, he said finally. I let her influence me too much. I'm sorry, Clara. I really am. Sorry isn't enough, Daniel, I said. It's too late for apologies. The damage is done. But what do you want me to do? He asked, his voice filled with desperation. How can I fix this? I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure what I wanted him to do. Part of me wanted him to cut his mother out of his life, to finally stand up to her and defend me. But another part of me knew that that was impossible. Eleanor had too much control over him. I don't know, Daniel, I said finally. I need some time to think. I hung up the phone, feeling even more confused and conflicted than before. I had expected Daniel to be angry, to be defensive of his mother, but his reaction had surprised me. He seemed genuinely remorseful, genuinely desperate to fix things. But was it too late? Could we ever rebuild the trust that Eleanor had destroyed? I spent the next few days in a state of turmoil. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I could barely function. I kept replaying the conversation with Daniel in my head, wondering if I had made the right decision. Finally, I decided that I needed to talk to him in person. I needed to see his face, to hear his voice, to get a sense of whether he was truly sincere. I called him and asked if we could meet. He agreed immediately. We decided to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in a nearby town. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Daniel was already there, sitting at a table by the window. He looked pale and drawn with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Clara, he said, standing up as I approached. Thank you for coming. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding. So, I said, what did you want to talk about? He took a deep breath. I talked to my mother, he said. My heart skipped a beat. And? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I confronted her about the letter, he said. I told her that I knew she was involved in some shady financial dealings. And what did she say? I asked, my voice trembling. She denied everything, of course, he said. She claimed that it was all a misunderstanding, that someone was trying to frame her. Did you believe her? I asked, my eyes searching his face. He hesitated for a moment. I don't know what to believe, he said. She's my mother, Clara. I want to believe her. But I also know that she's capable of anything. So, what are you going to do? I asked. He looked at me, his eyes filled with anguish. I don't know, he said. I'm torn, Clara. I love my mother, but I also love you. And I can't stand the thought of either of you getting hurt. I sighed. I understand, Daniel, I said. But you need to make a choice. You can't keep trying to please everyone. You need to decide who you're going to stand by. He was silent for a long time, staring out the window. Finally, he turned back to me, his eyes filled with determination. I've made a decision, Clara, he said. I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to cooperate with the authorities. I'm going to tell them everything I know about my mother's financial dealings. My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Daniel was actually going to betray his own mother? Are you sure about this, Daniel? I asked. This is a huge decision. It could have serious consequences. I'm sure, Clara, he said. It's the only way to clear my conscience. It's the only way to prove to you that I'm truly sorry. I looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of doubt or hesitation, but all I saw was sincerity. Okay, Daniel, I said. Then I'll stand by you. I'll support you no matter what happens. And that's exactly what I did. Over the next few weeks, Daniel worked with the authorities, providing them with all the evidence he had about Eleanor's financial crimes. It was a difficult and stressful time. Eleanor was furious, of course. She accused Daniel of betraying her, of ruining her life. She tried to guilt him, to manipulate him, to get him to change his mind. But Daniel stood firm. He refused to back down. He was determined to do what was right, even if it meant sacrificing his relationship with his mother. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Eleanor mounted. It became clear that she was indeed guilty of serious financial crimes. Finally, the authorities decided to arrest her. The day they came to take her away was one of the most surreal days of my life. I stood with Daniel outside Eleanor's mansion, watching as the police led her away in handcuffs. Eleanor looked at us, her eyes filled with rage and betrayal. "You'll regret this, Daniel," she screamed. "You'll both regret this." And then she was gone. As I stood there, watching her disappear into the police car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, satisfaction, but also sadness. I had finally gotten my revenge. I had finally exposed Eleanor for who she truly was. But it had come at a great cost. Daniel had lost his mother. I had lost my marriage. And both of us had been forever changed by the events of the past few months. But as I looked at Daniel, standing beside me, his face etched with sorrow but also with determination, I knew that we had done the right thing. We had chosen justice over loyalty. We had chosen truth over deception. And maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild our lives together. But the story doesn't end there. Because even after Eleanor's arrest, there were still secrets to be revealed. There were still hidden agendas to be uncovered. And there was still one final confrontation to be had. I'm going to stop here for now. The next part is going to be the climax of the story. The final showdown. The weeks following Eleanor's arrest were a blur. The media was all over the story. Socialite arrested for financial crimes. The headlines screamed. Daniel and I were hounded by reporters, desperate for an exclusive interview. We refused, of course. We just wanted to be left alone to process everything that had happened. Daniel was a mess. He felt guilty, conflicted, and utterly heartbroken. He was grieving the loss of his mother, even though she was still alive. He kept replaying their last conversation in his head, wishing he could have said something different, something that would have made her understand. I tried to be there for him, to offer him comfort and support, but it was hard. I was still struggling with my own emotions, still trying to come to terms with the fact that the woman who had tried to destroy my life was now facing serious jail time. One evening, Daniel came to me with a request. "Clara," he said, his voice hesitant, "I need to visit my mother. Will you come with me?" I was surprised by his request. I hadn't expected him to want me to be there. "Are you sure, Daniel?" I asked. "It might be difficult. For both of us, I know," he said. "But I need you there. I can't face her alone. And I want her to see that we're still together, that she didn't win." I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face Eleanor again, but I knew that Daniel needed me, and I couldn't refuse him. "Okay, Daniel," I said. "I'll go with you." The next day, we drove to the county jail where Eleanor was being held. The atmosphere was grim and depressing. The guards were cold and indifferent. The other visitors looked weary and defeated. We were led to a small visiting room, separated from Eleanor by a thick glass window. We sat down on the hard plastic chairs and waited. A few minutes later, Eleanor was led into the room. She looked different than I remembered. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were hollow and lifeless. She looked defeated. She sat down across from us, her gaze fixed on Daniel. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold and bitter. "I just wanted to see you, Mom," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." "Okay?" she scoffed. "How can I be okay? My life is ruined, and it's all your fault." "I didn't want this to happen, Mom," Daniel said. "I just wanted you to tell the truth." "The truth?" she spat. "The truth is, you betrayed me. You chose her over me. You ruined everything." She glared at me, her eyes filled with venom. "This is all your fault," she hissed. "You came into our lives and destroyed everything." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "That's not true, Eleanor," I said. "I didn't destroy anything." "You did. You destroyed your own life with your lies and your manipulation." "Shut up," she screamed. "You don't know anything. You're just a nobody. You're not good enough for my son. Maybe not," I said. "But I love him, and I'm not afraid to stand up to you. You've been bullying people your entire life, Eleanor. It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." She stared at me, her face contorted with rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said. "You think you've finally gotten rid of me. But you're wrong. I'll be back. And when I am, I'll make you both pay." I didn't respond. I just looked at her, my eyes filled with pity. She was so consumed by her own anger and bitterness that she couldn't see the damage she had caused. Daniel stood up, his face pale. "We should go, Clara," he said. "There's no point in talking to her." I nodded and stood up as well. We turned to leave, but before we reached the door, Eleanor called out to us. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer now, "please, just tell me one thing. Do you hate me?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then turned back to face her. "No, Mom," he said, his voice filled with sadness. "I don't hate you. I love you. But I can't condone what you did. You need to take responsibility for your actions." And with that, we left. We walked out of the visiting room, out of the jail, and back into the cold, harsh reality of our lives. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Eleanor fought the charges tooth and nail, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Finally, she was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Daniel was devastated. He visited her regularly in prison, trying to maintain some semblance of a relationship. But it was difficult. Eleanor was still bitter and resentful, still blaming him for her downfall. As for me, I tried to move on with my life. I got a new job, a new apartment, and a new perspective. I started to focus on myself, on my own happiness. Daniel and I stayed together, but our relationship was never quite the same. The events of the past year had changed us, had left us both scarred. We tried to rebuild our trust, to reconnect on a deeper level. But it was hard. The shadow of Eleanor loomed over us, a constant reminder of the pain and betrayal we had endured. Eventually, we came to the realization that we couldn't make it work. We loved each other, but we were too damaged, too broken. We made the difficult decision to separate. It was amicable, but it was still painful. We knew that it was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. So, where am I now? Well, I'm single. I'm working on myself. I'm trying to find happiness in the simple things in life. I still think about Daniel sometimes. I wonder how he's doing, if he's found peace. I hope he has. And I still think about Eleanor. I wonder if she's ever come to terms with what she did, if she's ever taken responsibility for her actions. I doubt it. But you know what? I'm okay. I've survived. I've learned a lot about myself, about love, about loss. And I've come to the realization that I don't need anyone else to make me happy. I can find happiness within myself. So, that's my story. It's a story of love, betrayal, revenge, and ultimately, forgiveness. It's a story about how one woman's twisted ambition can destroy lives, but it's also a story about resilience, about the power of the human spirit to to overcome even the most difficult challenges. I don't know if there's a moral to the story. Maybe it's just a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you need to be most wary of. Or maybe it's a story about hope, a reminder that even after the darkest of times, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know, but I do know that I'm grateful for the experience. Even though it was painful, it's made me stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And for that, I'm thankful.